Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro, friends. I'm sorry, first of all, before we get started, that there wasn't an episode of the Daily Coffee Pro yesterday. There was an epic Map It Forward podcast episode that went for 3 hours and just was intense. And so for that reason, after we were done from that conversation, didn't really have much left in the brain tank to then have a discussion about anything else after that. So I apologize for that. We're here today to talk about who's making all the money in the coffee supply chain. This is a direct flow on from yesterday's episode of the Map It Forward podcast, where we spoke with Stephen Bannister, who is a sea market trader, and Felipe Croce, who is a coffee producer from Brazil and an exporter of coffee out of Brazil. Our discussion yesterday, although it was very intense and it was very long, it went for 3 hours. I encourage you to listen to it. You may need to listen to it over a couple of days because it is quite intense. And so, we're waiting for probably about a week before people will get back to us with what the feedback from the episode was. We are encouraging feedback from that. Something that became apparent is the coffee supply chain is nowhere near as straightforward as a lot of us might think it is. It's not as simple as a farmer grows a coffee tree. We pick the cherry from that tree. We then have it sent somewhere so that the cherry can be turned into a seed. The seed then gets exported, imported into another country, sold to a roaster, and then the roaster turns that green coffee brown and sells it to a cafe or sells it through a subscription service on their website. It's nowhere near as simple as that. Not even close. Coffee, even if we just look at it before the point of where it gets to export, and we look at what we spoke about yesterday with regards to Brazil, and Brazil's one of the less complex countries that coffee is processed in. Coffee gets grown and then it gets picked, and then that could be the end of things for one particular farmer. They may turn around and say, well, I just want to grow cherry and sell it. All right, so then it swaps hands. And it may swap hands to go to the mill to be processed for the first time, because it's going to get processed twice. It's going to get processed at both of those times. It could get processed, most likely will get processed by two different companies. And so how it gets to that mill, depending on what origin it is and depending on what region it is, that could be different as well. So it could get picked up at the farm gate by a coyote, who then takes it to the mill and sells it to the first mill, right? The mill that's going to wet process it. And then that needs to get processed by another company to turn it into dry parchment that's going to exchange hands again. So just in that situation there, we have a number of complex systems where money is changing hands. And each time a little bit more is put onto the cost of the coffee. Then we get into a situation of, while all that's going on, many months earlier to that, if we're talking about commercial coffee, commodity coffee, that coffee may have been traded on the sea market and is now getting processed through harvest and through all of those things so that it's ready for a futures contract that was traded months ago. money was already made or lost on those contracts. And then the coffee is going to be exported out of the country. So it's gone from the farm gate, milled twice, then handed over to the exporter to what we call free on board. There are a number of steps in there that the price has changed. And as far as the farmer can take it down that into the supply chain, the more money they're going to make. But the further they take it into that supply chain, the more risk they're going to carry. The cost of production and the cost of doing business are two very different numbers. I think we've well established this past couple of weeks through the Mapper Forward social media that the farmers are not the ones that are making money in the supply chain, because they're not even getting paid what the cost of production is. And if you want to equate, another way to think about cost of production, think of your cost of goods in a store. You know, what's the cost of goods of making a cup of coffee? That doesn't take into account the cost of doing business, the fixed costs that are associated to that, right? So we know the farmer isn't the one that's winning big in most of the cases here, because if we look at the C market, where the majority of the coffee that's produced in the world is traded, a lot of the time, and particularly now, the C market is trading lower than the cost of production. And that's not taking into account the cost of doing business, which when we look at the cost of doing business, we have to, for these farmers, we have to take into account that includes the cost of the loans that they have to carry that keep them moving forward in business while they're waiting to get paid many, many months after they've delivered the coffee, because often they're not getting paid until the coffee has landed in warehouses and then gone and been sold on to the end, the roaster, the person who's going to do something with it, the end consumer of the green coffee. So we know that the farmers aren't making most of the money. They're not the ones that are getting rich off this. We learnt yesterday that the traders are making cents per pound. Well, that's, if I understood it correctly, the people who are importing the coffee are making cents per pound, and the traders are making cents per pound on the actual coffee. I wonder, I know for sure from what I've heard from some people, some traders, that the traders make the majority of their money on currency rather than on currency exchange rather than on the actual coffee itself. So if up until that point, people are still only making cents per pound on coffee, it leaves the roaster and the cafes. And so I know for a fact that the cafes are not making a lot of money on coffee, because a recent breakdown that we've done at our Mapper Forward workshops is presented by one of the presenters at our last conference in Sydney. We know that cafes are making 17 cents on an 8-ounce latte that's being sold for $4. So So we know that the cafes aren't making the get rich quick money off coffee, which leaves me wondering, are the roasters the ones that are making most of the money here? I have no idea, but that seems to be what was alluded to in yesterday's conversation. Something else that we need to find out is how much money are the banks making off of all of this? Farms have to borrow astronomical amounts of money. Coffee farms have to borrow astronomical amounts of money to stay in business. Are the banks the ones that are making all of the money in coffee? I honestly don't know. And this is why this is the primary reason I want to get an investigative journalist involved in this. I want them to follow the money. I want them to go on the quest of understanding who's making all the fucking money in coffee, because 160 million bags of coffee are produced annually from 40 countries around the globe. There's got to be somebody making a ton of money off of that, or a group of people who are making a ton of money off of that. There's a lot of people that are losing money off that. And before we can start looking at how we create some sort of equilibrium through that, we really do need to understand who are the people that are making a lot of money off of it. I can tell you that I was told an example last week that was quite disturbing. There is a company in Hawaii that doesn't typically trade in commodity coffee. They were approached by a major hotel chain. I'm not going to name any names in this yet. This coffee roaster who also is a buyer of green coffee went ahead and was asked to source coffee at a very reasonable price per pound. They typically don't deal in commodity coffee, as I said. So they offered the hotel coffee for $5 per pound roasted. The hotel sells the coffee at $7 a cup. This roaster did this in order to boost their brand, knowing that they are doing harm to the commodity market, well, to the coffee supply chain. I don't understand why people do these kinds of practices. If you're, to me, that is where a lot of the money's being made. To me, that's where I can clearly see that a lot of the money in the greed's being made, both there by the roaster and by the hotel. And at this stage, the hotel's pleading ignorant. I know of the person who brought this to my attention really wants to go and push an agenda with the hotel to make this point to them and let them know that, listen, by supporting this kind of practice of the purchase of commodity coffee to supply to your customers, you are hurting the planet. You're hurting people's livelihoods. So from what I can see right now, and I'd really like to be schooled on this if anyone knows better, or from what I can see now, the roaster is the person who's winning the most in the coffee supply chain. And I sure hope that's not the case, because I hear a lot of roasters crying poor. And they're not roasters. Well, I keep getting told that the roasters are poor because they're buying really great coffee. But I need to understand, I think we all need to understand, who is it that isn't crying poor? And who is it that's damaging the coffee supply chain through these practices? If you have any thoughts on this, please head to our social media at iMapItForward on Instagram or on our Facebook page and leave your comments. Share your thoughts with us. Right now we're exploring. We're trying to understand what the situation is. We're not trying to, this is not us trying to, it's not a witch hunt. It really isn't. But this is very, very unfair. We need to elevate the quality of our coffee supply chain. We can only do that if we all do it together. Peace, love, and peanut butter, friends. Have an amazing rest of your day.